How about how the 1960s affected racial issues and struggles?
Well, this was a huge time of change for racial and ethnic and issues and struggles. It really was rooted in the civil rights movement, like I mentioned, with African Americans, led by Martin Luther King and many others in the late 50s, with the demonstrations to integrate schools and integrate other places and to obtain rights, even voting rights for Black American people. But in the 60s, this developed beyond that particular community. And I think the next one that really began to emerge out of this was what became known as the women's liberation movement, where women began to rebel and men siding with them, or would side with them, for the greater rights of women in the workplace, to be paid equal pay, to be able to take different kinds of jobs, to be able to attend schools that they hadn't been able to attend before. I remember in my own school at Yale, undergraduates, women couldn't be undergraduates at Yale when I was there, and that all changed in the 60s. There are many schools around the country like that. So women rights became a very big part of the struggle in the 60s, and a lot of books were written, a lot of movements, demonstrations, women's groups formed, identity groups were formed, but then it spread to Native Americans. There were demonstrations and movements for greater rights and liberation by Native Americans. Alcatraz, the island at one time, was taken over by Native Americans, and it also moved to Asian people, and for the rights of Japanese and Chinese and other Asian groups who had been discriminated against historically, that there were movements against them against those discriminations. And the Chicano movement, the movement for migrant workers, this was very important in California, and this was also rooted very much in the civil rights movement that began with Martin Luther King. So I think that the 60s was a very important time in American history in the development of racial struggles for equality and rights, and against discrimination, against racism.
How about philosophy and the ways we think about God?
This was another area of great change that was taking place. Not everything was totally new, but the amount of newness that was happening was very important. Even the traditional churches, much of the practices and even the beliefs and the life of the traditional churches, like the traditional Catholic Church and the traditional Protestant churches, were being challenged and changed. It was in the 60s that the Second Vatican Council took place that made many great changes in the Catholic Church, and among the Protestant churches as well. There were changes challenging the way people worshipped and the way they talked about their belief systems, their theology, and how you could dress in church and what kind of activities the church would participate in society, participating in the civil rights movement and other social movements. There was a lot of conflict in the churches for that reason. But beyond traditional Christianity and the Christian churches, there was a tremendous growth of religious pluralism, or varieties of religions, growth of Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and other Eastern religions. And Berkeley was a center of a lot of this. And new religious movements that developed that hadn't ever existed before. One good example will be the Unification Church. Even though that started earlier, it grew by leaps and bounds in the Bay Area in the 1960s. And there were a whole bunch of commune kinds of religious groups and spirituality groups, so that religion was very much alive, but it was alive in ways that were new and different from the usual conforming kinds of practices and life of traditional Christian churches. So there was a lot of change, and thinking about God, well, all of these religious movements raised questions about the traditional understanding of God and what God is, who God is, how you talk about God. Even the use of the word God was often challenged. So that this too, there was a lot of newness and variety that was taking place.
Would you say that the 60s affected our lives today for the better or adversely?
I would say both. I think a lot of the freedom that the 60s were advocating, people were advocating this were very good. Certainly the freedoms of the racial struggles, civil rights, and for the greater rights of women. A lot of these things were very good. I think the freedom to speak out in protest against the government, even in time of war, if people are opposed to what the government is doing, I think that is good. Free speech, all of these things were very good, and many of them have become part of our way of life now. And even the freedom to dress in more individual ways, the way you want to, I think these are good. But I do think that some of the things that came out of the 60s haven't been so good. The continuation of the drug culture, this has been a very unfortunate development in modern life that didn't start in the 60s, but it grew so rapidly in the 60s. There was a lot of freedom, what we'd call sexual freedom, that happened also in the 60s. And I think that this sometimes has been responsible for some very unfortunate things like AIDS, HIV, sometimes the breaking down of family life, human relationships. Some of these things have not been good in our life. And so I think it's a mixed thing that the 60s affected us both positively and negatively. Could say a lot more about this, but you get the idea.
In that case, what lessons should we remember as a result of that time?
Well, I think it's important to be very aware. We learn to be very aware of life around us, to feel that we have a part to play in the society that we live in. The wrongs in society we should protest, and we should participate in building up the positives, and that it's okay to advocate change when change seems to be needed. But I think we need to not let ourselves fall into extremes. The extreme right or the extreme left or extreme liberal, extreme conservative, when that becomes intolerant and becomes thought of when we begin to think that we're the only way, that there's an absolute right and wrong. The lesson we have to learn is to be tolerant of other people and to be willing to listen to other people's views, and hoping that will give us greater understanding both of ourselves and of others, and certainly to avoid lawlessness and violence, because that just leads to more lawlessness and more violence. It never solves problems. So those are some of the lessons that I think we should learn. It's okay to be critical and to examine our lifestyles and the things that we are told we're supposed to conform to, and to weigh these things for their values, and feel free to be individuals and to do what we think is right.
Good.
Okay, I said enough?
Thank you.